This is a must tutorial for anybody that's adding horns, strings, or pretty much any sort of orchestral instrument, musical instrument onto your sync licensing tracks. As I review a lot of music and pro feedback, and from my experience with working with many different libraries, if you're adding any realistic instruments that come in the form of a VST, you have to spend an extra, I think it's about 10% effort to make sure you're bringing a dynamic performance to the track. Okay, so a lot of producers make this kind of newbie mistake where they want to throw horns on top of their track, and they just do something like what we're going to go through on this first example, which I call the boring horn version of this melody that I created. Okay, so they throw together some music and they put a horn on top that sounds something like this. So if you're listening to that and you think that sounds pretty good, like pretty realistic, we need to, I think the sample sounds realistic for sure. And this is, by the way, just a built-in plugin with Logic Pro 10. You can get this if you just download Logic Pro. It actually comes with the software. Logic is killing it these days with the quality samples they're doing. But to me, my ears hear that as a flat, dull, plain, and kind of a fake sounding performance. It just doesn't bring a lot of energy to it, doesn't bring a lot of emotion to it, and it doesn't feel like the producer took that extra 10% effort to add more dynamics to that instrument. So for those of you that I've given you reviews and told you need more dynamics with this is a tutorial that'll hopefully show you an example for A-B compare. This is a version without dynamics. Let's go to the more dynamic performance of this. I've simply copied and pasted the exact same performance, but as you see, I did two things to it actually. We're going to show you. I automated the volume, and then I also used the modulation wheel, because this particular horn sample, when you use your modulation wheel on your MIDI keyboard, actually adds a little bit of a vibrato to the performance. So with these two things that I added, first I'll play the boring one so we can kind of directly A-B compare so you can hear the difference. So let's go back to the boring one real quick. Okay, keep that in your head. Here's the dynamic one. So you hear the difference, right? So we have this vibrato coming in at the end of the phrases, and also we're growing a little bit in our volume. So one more time. Not a lot of work, actually. That basically took me about 2 to 3 minutes basically to complete, to draw in this automation. And I basically did this by ear as I'm hearing where these phrases go. I sort of bumped things up where I felt like we could be increasing, dropped it back down, tried to create as much of a realistic performance of as a horn player as I possibly could. And then down here, as you can see with the modulation wheel, I was basically live performing this. I didn't draw all these, thousands of dots in on the bottom here, but as it was performing, I was actually moving my modulation wheel. So as we got to the end of some of these longer phrases, I pushed it up so we have a little bit more of that vibrato effect. Okay. So as you can hear, if you had this performance on top of your track and maybe stacked up with some other harmonic horns, it just has a lot more life to it. It has a lot more oomph, and it feels a little bit more, I would say a lot more interesting. And it just is, it's delivering a lot more bang for the buck, essentially. Let's go through the same kind of idea with some strings here. So let's go ahead and get out of this. I think I didn't solo those great. So we're going to solo the boring strings here. So this is just a simple sort of string progression I created. As you can see, nothing is done. There's no automation. There's nothing happening. Let's take a listen to it, and then we're going to go move on to the dynamic strings. And actually, the dynamic strings had no modulation wheel to it, because these string samples, nothing happens when I touch the modulation wheel. It just didn't have any effect to it. So all I could actually work with was the volume automation. So I'm going to show you how even just volume automation, as weird as this little shape is that I created, creates so much more energy and emotion out of this. And again, this is after a couple of minutes of doing this. If this was a sync licensing track, I'd probably spend a couple more minutes just to make sure that things are really tight. But I'm going to show you what you can do in literally a few minutes. So here's the boring strings. One more time. These are pretty flat, not really interesting. You might like the chord progression, but it doesn't add a lot of hearts to it. There's just not a lot of dynamic live performance going on. Now, let's just throw about 3 minutes of work into our automation, and let's see what happens. So you can hear how that really pulls you in more, right? That should be feeling a lot more emotional to you. That should be feeling a lot more dynamic. That should feel a little bit more like a live orchestra actually performed that. And it's more about delivering the emotion, the emotion of the instrument, right? And when we have a quote unquote live performance of strings or horns or whatever it is, there's got to be this human feeling that kind of comes through it. And the way to deliver that human feeling is by creating these dips and valleys in our automation and with our volume and modulation wheel, if that can be applicable. If we literally just kind of come across here and we throw, this is how we're turning in our strings, where there's just no difference in any of the volume. It's straight across the board. Nothing has been modulated or anything like that, or just added a little bit of extra effort to. It will start to sound like your track was composed on a MIDI keyboard. It's actually one of the biggest notes that I give pro feedback members is, hey, love the music, love the ideas, but the way that you're putting these strings on your track, it sounds like somebody had a heavy hand on a MIDI keyboard. I don't feel that there was an actual human being performing these strings. I know that 99% of the time, we don't record live strings anymore. That's just something we don't do. We always use these VSTs that sound amazing. But just because you have a realistic sounding sample does not mean that that's as far as you have to do. It's just basically play it on your keyboard and hit print. You do need to do a little bit of this extra work. And this was, again, me drawing this in. You can do it live if you want to and record your automation. For me, sometimes I like to draw it in because I want to kind of play it back a few more times until I find out what feels like about right. I'll try different ideas. I'll have things grow in certain areas and maybe feel like, that's not really enough. That's not really the right direction. So I A/B compare and figure things out. And I felt like this was the pattern that sort of really sold this string sample. So let's go ahead and A/B compare it one more time so you can hear the difference. Here's the boring ones without anything. Okay, and here's the dynamic. So to me, it provides that X factor that's really needed for sync licensing, especially if you're going to get into these sort of styles of music or add these instruments onto your tracks, whatever you're going to do. So I know for some of you, this might be a bummer because you thought you could just literally throw a new track on top of your rock drums or rock music and think, oh, I have this orchestral rock hybrid because I have strings on it. Well, yes, you do have strings on it, but are you actually giving the strings the extra effort that they really do need? Okay, so some instruments need a little bit of extra polish, a little bit of elbow grease to make sure that they're really delivering that dynamic performance. So I hope this quick tutorial can show you how, at least I do it. There are probably dozens of ways to achieve your dynamics and your performance, so you don't have to do what I'm doing. You might have a different setup in your home studio, different modulation wheel, different plugins, of course, right? So don't see this as the only way to do it, but just see this as a sort of definitely a rule that if you're adding these live instruments, you have to do something like this. You have to add a little bit extra effort to make sure that you have licensable tracks. All right, hope you guys found this useful.